Hello, welcome to HLA Live. HLA Live is our regular broadcast on the HLA YouTube channel as well as all the other social media channels. Each week we talk to interesting people from across the HLA community.
Good evening, everyone. I am really excited to be chairing tonight's meeting.
Hi, I'm Rosie Spooner and I'm hosting HLA Live this Wednesday.
And I'm an HLA scholar and I'm also going to be your host this evening.
To share with us their ideas and their innovations and hopefully bring them to a global audience.
Quite quick, we have ideas, let's do this, let's do that. So
many of the topics come from our community, with scholars and faculty expressing an interest in many of the discussions that we're about to have.
Hello everyone and welcome to the HLA Live session on widening participation in the postgraduate realm.
Homelessness and health.
Addiction and the new normal.
HLA programs are built on 6 pillars. The leader is an innovator and entrepreneur. The leader is a communicator. The leader is a manager. The leader as a negotiator. The leader as a follower. And the leader as a philosopher. If you are interested in becoming a HLA scholar, why not get in contact? Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these important pillars. The HLA team consists of Pedra, Eamon, Tim, Riddy, Alistair, Adil and Trisha, and a range of other HLA scholars and faculty.
We are incredibly excited to host Dr. Lisa Sanders from Yale Medicine, and she'll be discussing the emerging specialty of rare diseases.
What if social media could save lives? Right now, there are literally millions of people struggling with undiagnosed medical conditions.
I'm Brittany, Kamaya's mom. She's 6 years old. She's paralyzed anywhere from 3 to 20 seconds, over 300 times a day.
I was in the Gulf War. I served 8 years, and now I'm losing my memory.
Every time the deja vu happens, I feel my eyes roll in the back of my head, and then I flatline.
Sadie has this incurable disease that the only thing you can do is, remove half of her brain. How could that be the only thing you do to a kid?
My body is going through something. The doctors are like, we can't help you.
I want to know if somebody else has this.
They need something different, the kind of thinking that happens usually outside the hospital. I'm Dr. Lisa Sanders, and I'm a physician at Yale. And for the past 15 years, I've written a column for the New York Times Magazine about patients who have mysterious symptoms, but I always wanted to go the next step. Using the internet, we have the ability to harness all the intelligence of people around the planet to get some answers.
I was thrilled to see that many responses.
It's what we hoped for.
Never, ever, ever give up.
There is somebody out there that understands.
The symptoms align perfectly with the things that I've experienced.
There's another mom out there like me that was looking for an answer. We're not the only ones.
You gotta keep a positive attitude.
It's good news.
We can create a movement. There's hope.
1, 2.
Are you trying to kick me? No! I did not do it on purpose.
I know.
Well, thank you so much, Charmy, and thank you for inviting me to this amazing conference. I'm excited to be part of this. I'd like to talk to you about something that I care about very deeply, which is diagnosis. I care about this so much that I have been writing a column for the New York Times Magazine called Diagnosis since 2002. So for nearly 20 years. Based on my column, I've had a bunch of television shows that came out of my column. The first was House. That was based on my column, and I worked as a consultant, and I'm very familiar with his craziness. And more recently, I did a series of documentaries for Netflix called Diagnosis. But in short, I've been thinking about diagnosis and diagnostic error for my entire career. And I want to share a little bit about what I found. So I want to tell you about a patient, because in medicine, you have to start with the patient. That's where that's what matters the most. And we're going to talk a little bit about diagnostic errors. They are frequent and sometimes terrible. And I'm going to talk about some of my ideas for improving diagnosis, including the creation of a specialty sort of created to imitate Dr. House. So first, the story. This is Tiffany. This is not actually Tiffany. HIPAA laws in the United States would never allow me to show the actual patient picture, but this is a representation. So Tiffany's a 26-year-old woman who was brought to the emergency department 3 years ago by ambulance after a witnessed tonic-clonic seizure. That's all we knew about her. Her past medical history was significant for peptic ulcer disease and hepatitis C. The only medicine she took was Harvoni, which she was taking to treat her hepatitis C, and she had just started that medicine. She was a school teacher, and she lived with her adoptive parents. She doesn't use alcohol or tobacco or any other drugs. Of note, this was actually her second visit to the emergency room that day. The first time she'd come with a complaint of abdominal pain, but had left before being seen. So in the emergency room, her vital signs were significant for a tachycardia to 134, blood pressure of 166/109. And on exam, her eyes deviated to the right, both of them. The rest of her exam was more or less normal once she recovered from her postictal state. However, she had several seizures while she was in the emergency department. So her EKG showed sinus tachycardia. She had a CT scan of her head that showed an area of attenuation in the left occipital region. Her labs were really unremarkable. Of note, she tried to leave against medical advice, but given the CT findings and her neurologic abnormalities, it was determined that she really did not have the capacity to choose to leave. So she had 2 more seizures while she was in the emergency department, and she had persistently elevated blood pressure, which was treated in the ED with labetalol. She was sent to the MICU, and while there, she had an MRI. So this is what her MRI showed. It showed a 7 by 4 centimeter, predominantly necrotic or cystic abnormality in the left occipital and medial parietal lobes. So the differential from the radiologist was that this was an abscess versus a vasogenic edema consistent with posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome, or PRES. So based on her clinical picture, it was thought that the patient most likely had PRES that was due to her remarkably high blood pressure. Her blood pressure was treated, and after several days, her mental status cleared and her high blood pressure was well controlled on Norvasc, 5 milligrams, and metoprolol, 50 milligrams. She was continued on Dilantin when she was discharged home. So she returned to the hospital 10 days later following another tonic-clonic seizure, despite being on phenytoin. This time, she was still tachycardic, still somewhat hypertensive. Her exam was significant, though, this time for proximal muscle weakness. Her strength was 3 out of 5 in her upper extremities and only 1 out of 5 in her lower extremities. Also, her sodium was low. She was hyponatremic with a sodium of 114. The phenytoin level was normal, and she had another MRI, and it showed that the lesion in her brain was getting better. So she was admitted to the MICU and treated for her hyponatremia, and they thought at the time that it was SIADH from her brain injury, and the patient was fluid restricted and her sodium corrected. She was admitted to the floor, And at that time, she was very confused. She was hallucinating about a cat in her bed, and she asked several times for help taking off her shoes, but she wasn't wearing any shoes. She also complained of feeling extremely weak. The doctor in charge of her care was Dr. Stephen Holt, a young and very promising physician at Yale. He was determined not to let this patient go home again without a diagnosis. So he looked at everything they knew about her, chose what he thought were the most important aspects of her case, and put together a problem list. She had an extensive workup. This was the problem list she had. This was the workup she had before she came to Dr. Holt. So in thinking about her, he thought about her complaints, which were abdominal pain, weakness, and an altered mental status. She had a new medication that had been added to she wasn't taking any medicines until she started taking Harvoni a couple of weeks before all this started. Her exam, which was significant for hypertension, tachycardia, a strangely normal abdominal exam despite her frequent complaints of abdominal pain, and now weakness. Lastly, her hyponatremia. So thinking about this, he had to try to put together, to try to recognize some underlying pattern. And he knew that whatever she had, it was going to be something strange. So finally, he thought that it was most likely acute intermittent porphyria. When I asked Colt Steve about making this unusual diagnosis, he described a process of boiling everything down into little tidy boxes and then letting his imagination wander through. He knew it was going to be an entity from that basket of stuff that's very unusual. So he just closed his door and spent some time thinking about her, and he came up with the answer. So just a brief word about acute intermittent porphyria. It's a rare inherited metabolic disorder that affects the complex process of putting together a fundamental bodybuilding block known as heme. We think about heme primarily as part of the structure of hemoglobin, but this complex compound is used in many different ways in the body. Heme plays a huge role in, say, gas exchange and mitochondrial energy production. It's an important part of antioxidant defense and signal transduction. And that's just a few of the roles it plays. It's a big deal compound in the body. However, you see here the pathway to creating heme, and every step along this pathway carries the possibility of an error, and each error results in at least the possibility of a disorder. Acute intermittent porphyria is just one of those disorders. So AIP is characterized by a deficiency of the enzyme porphobilinogen deaminase. When this system is taxed by hormones, by new drugs, even by illness, the body tries to make heme, but without this enzyme, it ends up with an accumulation of toxic porphyrin precursors in the body. These precursors can have a devastating effect on the nervous system, and that's what caused all of Tiffany's symptoms. The disease is treated with glucose in a pinch. There's a compound known as hematin, which can replace heme in the body, and in that way shuts down the production of these toxic entities. And for Tiffany, she was treated with this and started to get better. But her road to recovery took a long while, months, nearly a year. She's well now and has many fewer of these terrible attacks now that she knows what she has. So porphyria is only one of the 7,000 rare diseases we currently know about. And there are more identified every year. 30 million Americans have a rare disease. That's nearly 10% of the US population. And up to 350 million people worldwide have a rare diagnosis. It turns out rare diseases, they're not so rare. Tiffany was one of the lucky ones. It only took her a few months to get the diagnosis. The average time to diagnosis for most people in the US and in Europe who have porphyria, 12 years. The average time to diagnosis for most rare diseases is 6 years. So why does it take so long? Why do doctors have such a hard time diagnosing diseases that affect so many people? Well, it turns out we doctors, we don't just miss the rare diseases. It turns out the diagnostic errors are terrifyingly common. When a patient comes to see a doctor with a symptom, with a question, "Doctor, what's wrong with me?" usually it's the most common, the most likely diagnosis that will come to the doctor's mind first. And most of the time, we'll be right. The most likely diagnosis is what most patients will have. The brain likes to go with the easiest answer, and experience tells us that that easy answer is often right. So it's not being lazy. These doctors are not lazy. These doctors have learned that that's often right. And the research that has been done backs that up. A recent study showed that going with the first answer will get us to the right diagnosis up to 95% of the time. 95%, well, that's pretty good. It does, however, mean that 5% of the time we will have made a wrong diagnosis. And if you do the math, here in the US, that turns out to be 12 million Tiffany's every year. Or how about this number? Up to 90,000 people die in the hospital in the United States every year because of a wrong or a missed diagnosis. That is twice the number of people who die in car accidents in the US every year. And it's the equivalent of a 747 jet crashing every single day of the year. Turns out that is a lot of people. The NIH published a report on diagnostic error in 2015 that brought the issue even closer to home. It says that most of us will experience at least one diagnostic error in our lifetime, and that some of those errors will have catastrophic consequences. It's a problem for us all. So, what can we do to reduce these errors? I think there are 3 ways to make this essential practice better. First, we need to be better at training doctors to make diagnoses. Second, there is no improvement in virtually anything you do without feedback. We need to find more ways to let doctors know how they're doing. We don't have that right now, or most of the time, we don't have that. And specialization. I think there needs to be a specialty in rare diagnoses. I wish I could clone the doctor who made Tiffany's diagnosis. Doctors who know a lot and are willing and able to spend time thinking. Doctors who work hard to teach themselves to become a good diagnostician. But I say it shouldn't have to be this hard. I think we should help doctors become the Steve Holtz of the world by developing specialty in diagnosis where they learn about these oddities right from the beginning. So let's start at the beginning. All doctors need to be trained in the art of making a diagnosis. We used to teach the Harrison's way in medical school and even in residency. We start with the disease and its pathology and then slowly make our way to the patient and how it shows up in the patient, in the bed, or in your office. That doesn't really make a lot of sense because we're trained to take care of not diseases, but of patients. We need to start with the patient. And that's beginning to happen. I mean, this is a book I love. It came out, all over a decade ago. Then it starts with the symptoms, starts with the patient and what they're feeling, and tracks how to think about that symptom to get to a diagnosis. That's we see diseases in the context of the patient. We should learn them that way as well. I think there's also different ways to talk about diseases as we see patients. One of the things we do in my program, and I know at Yale Medical School, is we teach illness scripts. We teach people what a disease looks like instead of leaving you to Harrison's to go through all of this. We try to get you to boil it down and give you a structure for thinking about the diseases in a way that makes sense, in a way that's immediately accessible. So I'm a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes, and I think that he understood how we think really well. And one of the things he talked about was how the mind is like an attic. If you just throw everything into it willy-nilly, it's going to fill up really quickly, and you'll never be able to find anything. So he made the argument that if you're trying to learn something, you should learn it in a systematic way so that you can access it. And illness scripts is one of the ways that we try to teach medical students and doctors how to think about an illness so that it comes to mind more easily. So I think training needs to be changed. But I think we also need feedback. 80% of drivers, this is an old statistic, 80% of drivers rate themselves as being above average in driving skills. You know why? It's because they don't get any feedback to tell them otherwise. Here is a gentleman who is offering some gentle feedback to a fellow driver, but you can imagine that that's not really heard. Whoever cut him off or whatever they did is driven away, didn't even see the guy, because if he had, he wouldn't have cut him off in the first place. So there's got to be a way for drivers to get real-time roadside feedback if we expect them to get better. Usually it takes more help than just a gentle window side opinion to help us see the errors in our driving. And direct feedback on our performance is essential. And it's the same in medicine. This is direct feedback. We hope it doesn't go that way, but in driving, this is often what it takes. We hope in medicine that it's not what it takes. A patient comes to the physician with a symptom. The doctor takes a history, performs an exam, maybe sends off a test or two, but then he or she makes a diagnosis and comes up with a treatment plan and sends the patient home. And when the patient doesn't come back, the doctor thinks, oh yeah, totally nailed it. Got the diagnosis right, the patient got better. But of course, there are other possibilities. We need feedback to let us know how we are actually doing, to know if we got it right, or if the patient had one of the other possibilities. This is already happening, but in a very limited way. One of the busiest emergency rooms in New York City, the emergency room doctors are notified when a patient they saw and sent home comes back to the hospital within 72 hours. They can review the records and see if maybe they missed something. That's good feedback. And there are surgical robots that help novice surgeons improve their skills by showing them how the experienced surgeons operate or did the same operation. That's feedback too. And there's a smartwatch that provides immediate feedback on the speed and depth of chest compressions when those learning to perform CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, are learning. The point is, these are ways for doctors to see for themselves how well they're doing, to see what's working, and what's not working. And we need more. The more feedback loops we have in place, the more opportunities we have to learn from our mistakes and do better. But will any of these efforts help the Tiffanys of the world, those with rare diseases? One thing we know about diagnosis that we've learned from research that was done in the 70s is that the doctor most likely to make a difficult diagnosis is the doctor who's seen it before. Now, of course, every institution has a handful of doctors, who really seem to have seen it all. At Yale, we have a hematologist named Tom Duffy, who knows everything, and Andre Sofer, a general internist, who also seems to know everything. I'm sure there are doctors at your institutions, you all know who they are, who are the same. They seem to know everything. I propose that we create a specialty in diagnosis to teach doctors to know, if not everything, then a lot more about rare diseases than we do now. A specialist who, like the fictional Gregory House, will focus on unusual diseases, a zebra specialist, if you will. It used to be that it was the internist who made the rare diagnoses, at least in the United States. That's no longer the case. It used to be that there were general practitioners, people with 1 year of postgraduate training, who saw most patients, and the internist was just used when that general practitioner was stumped. That's not the case anymore. Certainly, we get to make the difficult diagnosis every now and then, just as we diagnose diseases in every subspecialty. But that's not what we mostly do. What we mostly do is diagnose and treat the real killers of Americans, chronic diseases. Who populates our schedules? Are they zebras from all around town? No. Most of us take care of patients who have diabetes, who have high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease, obesity, the things that really kill us. And if you define importance in medicine as the number of lives saved, then I would say that we internists have the most important job in medicine. These chronic diseases not only take up a huge amount of time and space on our schedules, but it's what we read about. It's what we think about. It's what we learn about. Pick up the Annals of Internal Medicine or JAMA or the Journal of General Internal Medicine, even the New England Journal. The vast majority of the articles in those publications address common diseases, chronic diseases. Sure, there are the CPCs in the New England Journal that will go through a rare disease that's presented to a doctor. But mostly, we internists think about, read about, and learn about the bread and butter diseases that have the potential to pick off our patients like snipers on a roof. That's great, but not for the Tiffanys of the world. I think we should train a subset of these internists to take on these odd cases, these difficult diagnoses, these patients with rare diseases. These kinds of places already exist. In the United States, patients in need of a diagnosis often go to the Mayo Clinic or to the Cleveland Clinic. Or when all else fails, we try to get them into the NIH's Undiagnosed Diseases program. Why not train a wider swath of doctors to be these kinds of specialists? Where would they go to learn these skills? Well, there's no place now unless you happen to do your residency or fellowship at Mayo or the NIH. I'm working on developing such a fellowship with the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine. We have a fellowship in diagnosis, but at this point, it's still focused on training mostly internists to do research on diagnosis and diagnostic error. But I'm working with my colleagues at CITM to put together a different track, one that would train doctors in these oddities. However we do it, we need to get better at diagnosis. Diagnosis is the most important part of the doctor's job. Whether it's a rare disease, or a bread and butter ailment, it is only when the diagnosis is right that we can initiate the right treatment. And it's only once the doctor and patient know the diagnosis that they can peer into the future and see what lies ahead. Training, feedback, specialization, these are basic management tools. Their value is universally recognized in business, in government, in professional and amateur sports, and in countless other fields. We need them here too. It's time for everyone in medicine to get better at diagnosis. Our lives and the lives of our patients depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, Dr. Lisa Sanders. We really enjoyed your talk on the emerging speciality of rare diseases.
Thank you to everyone that made tonight's episode possible. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing our health systems, we encourage them to think about how they make significant change in the world of healthcare. We are incredibly lucky to have some incredible scholars in the HLA. They use the HLA as a platform to take their ideas and bring them to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, why not join us at one of our future HLA events? Why not join one of our programs? Why not even become a HLA scholar? Thank you for joining us. My name is Johan Marlwaner, the Director of the HLA, and it's a good night from all of us.